Yeah,
There we go. Great. Thank you, Matt.
no problem.
Welcome, everyone. Thanks for joining us. Jennifer and I are going to take a little bit of time to share a couple of little stories with you based on our journey towards implementing the teaching support team. And we're going to look at both a regional big picture version and then zero in on one particular school and their story as they went through their journey or going through their journey towards inclusive education. So before we get into that, though, maybe we'll introduce ourselves. Jennifer, you go ahead.
I'm Jennifer McDonald. I'm a student services consultant for the Strait Regional Centre for Education, and my schools are in Antigonish and Guysborough County.
And I'm Lynn Casey, and the last 3 years I was a student equity consultant with the Strait Regional Centre for Education, and I worked with all schools in our region and worked very closely several times with Jennifer in working with schools to help implement inclusive education. So on that note, we'll get started. You'll notice here, of course, this is the acknowledgement of Mi'kmaq traditional territory. So we'd like to acknowledge that the land on which the Strait Regional Centre for Education operates, and of course the Department of Education of Nova Scotia, for time immemorial is in Mi'kma'ki, the traditional ancestral territory of the Mi'kmaq people. And we aren't going to do this activity with you folks, but throughout our presentation, we do reference a lot of situations where we regionally modeled several activities for both regional staff and administrators to take back to their schools. Some are very simple and basic, like this particular one, and some are a bit more involved. But we really, and we'll talk about this a little bit later, but we really tried to regionally model a lot of inclusive activities as we went forth. So the learning intentions for us today, again, we would highlight within our work that we do that presenting learning intentions and even creating them together is wonderful, but making sure that we are very clear with what our learning intentions are for whatever sessions we're doing. So our learning intentions today are to see where we as the SRCE are in our journey to inclusive ed, to see how schools are able to support each other through teaching support team to leverage better supports for students, to show one school journey and how they started, and to focus on high leverage teaching practices to enable opportunities for relationship and collaboration. So we will highlight a few of these that we've seen schools try and experience. We also want to, before we get into sharing the school's experience, we'd like to briefly describe our own inclusive ed strategy from SRCE, very, very briefly, but we think it's important to kind of set the backstage here. So stage one, all up to stage 4 with all different groups. Our goal was to sort of set that common understanding or develop a common understanding together. And as we rolled the stages out, we were able to reach all staff, all schools, and all regional staff as well. And we continue to build that understanding. And really the main goal, as we know that the most impact happens in the classroom, the main goals you'll see at the bottom is to kind of come to that understanding that equity and inclusion and high impact practices equal that really strong tier 1 teaching universal design for learning that best meets a variety of learner profiles. And you noticed in the last stage there, our last stage was to bring school lead teams together. And what we did is we brought those lead teams together in smaller groups. So we would bring like schools together where we felt either were similar in structure and population, or even similar to where they were on their journey, so that in the future they could network together. And we do have plans to bring them in on a regular basis as small groups to sort of touch base again, see how everyone's doing, and give them some working time. So I'll let Jennifer get right into describing a bit of the roles leading up to what would happen at our schools. And it just, I guess, one more thing I'd like to add is when we followed through with those stages of our inclusive ed rollout. So our goal, of course, was to do that and do our regional work. And then what we have really tried to do since then, as each group of schools was getting this professional learning, is we check in and say, okay, what are schools doing with this now? We've all have come to this common understanding. How are schools making it work for them? So go ahead, Jennifer.
So yeah, just to follow with what Lynn's saying is that in terms of rolling something out regionally, the idea wasn't to give them something, a preset or a prescriptive manual of how to do inclusive education. Basically, we developed a common understanding so they understood the context of what they had to work in. But, you know, so through those activities, we modeled what we really want to see for our students, which was having them engage in problem solving and figuring out what worked for them and deciding where they were as a staff and what their next steps were. So in presenting that, one of the things that we also did is we tried to build capacity with our learning support teachers and some of our knowledgeable others in terms of understanding how to coach. And what we really did is we kind of talked about that last year at the Summer Learning Academy, where we talked about how we leveraged our learning support teachers to start working with our classroom teachers to ensure that strategies for all students were happening at a tier 1 level. And Lynn actually has a great quote from Katie Novak that says, you can't intervention your way out of weak tier 1. So tier 1 is the basis that we need to make sure that is really solid so that our tier 2 and our tier 3 work in sync with all of that. So when I'm talking about that coaching practice, these 4 pieces, these are the 4 key ingredients that we talked about that we went over with our learning support teachers and making sure that they understood that these were all important aspects, or these were the ingredients to making sure that they were working alongside classroom teachers. And so we can go to the next slide. But the most important out of all of those is collaboration. Because without collaboration, you cannot have meaningful discussion about data. You cannot have, you're going to have, if people are working in isolation, you have you and I versus we. And when you have you and I, you're not sure if the intervention that you're doing is actually working. And having said that, when you get to evidence of change, what we use and what we tend to talk about, we talk about things that are more about what we did or what the instructional practices were, rather than how it actually impacted the students and how we know that they benefited from it. So when we talk about the significance and the importance of collaboration, the school that we're using as a model really dove into this. And I will preface it by saying this was not the this wasn't a school that said, oh yeah, we know how to do this, we've done this before, and fell into it easily. They really had to engage and start thinking about what that was going to look like. So when you hear their story, you're going to hear them talk about the difference between understanding something theoretically and the difference between actually putting it into practice. And so, you know, all of these aspects came up. So in their minds, they knew what they needed to do. But when it came to actually putting it into practice, they really had to get creative with what they were going to do. So the first person we're going to talk about is the vice principal at East Antigonish Education Centre and Academy. Her name is Pauline McKinnon. And I have a quote from her in November where she actually said to me, you know, I wasn't really sure if I understood what teaching support team was. I just knew it had to be different than the school planning team. It wasn't just a change in acronym. So what she really tried to consider was how she was going to switch from school planning teams to teaching support teams and having that collective efficacy and having groups of teachers working together. So we'll play a video of Pauline.
So when we started in September, we quickly realized that allocating the teachers to the LSTs to the teachers didn't really work. It was just because it was, yet the teachers thought, oh, I have you for the whole year, which wasn't necessarily what we were thinking. We were thinking like short tier one support for a little bit of time and then move on. But they were like, you're supposed to be in my room all the time. You're supposed to be helping me all the time, which wasn't really our idea. It didn't really go well. But what really went well is we had time in our schedule where we did grade level meetings. So at the beginning of the year, we met, especially with the junior high and the high school, we met together as a team and we went through and we did all the adaptations and all, like any information that we need sharing for our students together. So, and then we tried to also look at adaptation and like, do we really need this adaptation or is this part of UDL? Is this something that we're doing for everybody? Does it really need to be documented? The teachers really liked this, and because it started off, everybody was on the same page, and then we continued for the first semester the grade level meetings because we were able to come together as a team, and if the grade 7s were having issues, classroom management in all the classes, or one teacher was having problems and they're like, oh, what are you doing? It gave them time to come together and talk, which a lot of times doesn't really happen when you get up into the junior high and the high school. The elementary, it's more, the way that we teach elementary is more inclusive. It's so when we started in September,
There we go. There we go. So one of the things
Sorry about that.
That's okay. It always does that for some reason. It keeps looping around. But one of the things that Pauline is kind of addressing that her school is unique because we have a lot of them in our region. We have a lot of P-12 schools. And so what they knew is that they knew, okay, you know, our elementary, they could see evidence of the collaboration, but getting up to junior high and high school, they were really struggling with having their teachers working together. Everybody was sort of siloed and working in isolation. So when they moved to grade level meetings, they started where they started where they were, and they started working with having them work together. Because one of the pieces that I'm showing you right now is this working with a classroom teacher. We went over last year, we actually talked about with our schools about what it is and what it is not. And so our LSTs had a good understanding of what it was supposed to look like. However, it was really hard for them to be able to establish those boundaries without and still develop that working relationship. So that was one of the things that Pauline found, that she had to support her teachers in terms of getting around that.
And Jennifer mentioned that she did this work with learning support teachers. So all of our learning support teachers in our region, through Jennifer and another student services consultant, worked with all learning support teachers. And my role regionally as a student equity consultant was, I was a co-lead for Inclusive Ed Rollout. So I would, with our team, we would do school professional learning. And this was a piece also that all staff received. So not only was the student services able to kind of focus in on that with learning support, but we were able to give the same messages, perhaps in a bit of a different environment, to all staff. So everyone had that common understanding, or at least, you know, the beginning of a common understanding of what the expectations were.
Yeah. And it again, if we don't have that collaboration and having it working purposefully, you can't pretend it away. You need this to happen so that you can build up your discussion, so that when you're discussing data and moving into talking about meaningful intervention, it's actually working. So this is a very key point.
Mm-hmm. So I'll just skip ahead to the next piece. So this was another common piece that we would have done both with all schools, all staff, and that Jennifer and her team through student services would have spent extra time, or different time, if you will, in a different audience, working with all learning support teachers. And to, as Jennifer said, we can't do it alone. And we shouldn't do it alone. Absolutely shouldn't do it alone. The teaching support team is a combination of all sorts of staff members with all sorts of skills. And basically, it's that commitment to meet learner profiles and class profiles and learning needs, and at the same time building capacity through teaching strategies. And also it could lead to, which often does, would lead to some of those tier 2 and tier 3 interventions.
So one of the things that really came up with when we talk about requests to teaching support teams is that we kind of dove in a little bit further into the school to look into how teachers were managing that. So we hear how admin tried to create those opportunities for teachers to start meeting, but then they also they needed to kind of figure that out themselves. So our next example is a grade 9 student who had typically always been in an alternate setting, a student with ASD, and the school needed to move to 50% classroom, 50% learning center at grade 9. And so what they needed to do is work with classroom teachers into making sure that there was tier 1 was in place so that this student was able to participate in some of those classroom activities. So we're going to hear from Amy Hoodry, who was a grade 9 ELA teacher, and Marcia Purcell, who was the learning support teacher, and kind of how they started that collaboration and how they used the teaching support team to start to build capacity within those classrooms and within the teachers so that they could support the student in the classroom.
So as a TST, we met very frequently and on a regular basis. We were checking in with each other in the mornings, at lunch, after school, and it was really great for us to be able to connect so often instead of waiting for a scheduled meeting to happen. We were able to meet and kind of discuss any issues or concerns that we had that needed to be addressed immediately. And we were able to make a decision as a team, talk about the resources that we may have needed, the people that we needed to connect with, and the support that we needed, and figure out what our next step was going to be. So it was definitely a real team effort, and definitely helped contribute to our student success in the classroom.
And there were like a lot of people involved in different ways in the team, but not necessarily, like everybody didn't necessarily have to be there at every single meeting or every different time. We drew on those resources over time as we knew we needed them. At times that involved, shifting a meeting to the school day so that we could have both of our students' TAs present because we knew they had really valuable information. It involved student services consultant. It involved our educational psychologist, our speech path, our CYCP, all of our classroom teachers at different times. But it wasn't necessarily that we had to meet everybody to death. It was just using those resources when we needed them.
So as
Just before Lynn starts, I will preface that by saying that Amy was the first teacher to start with Marcia, and as they started having more success, and because of the grade level meetings, more teachers became engaged and created room within the classroom to support the student.
If you remember back to the vice principal's comment, being a P to 12, she did mention that, there is a significant difference between generally how we teach in elementary versus how we teach in high school. And so we fully acknowledge too that we know that it is a different approach in high school. And so we need to go about inclusive education in a different way. But in saying that though, these are some things that we know that we're hearing from our high schools and our high school teachers that we know work really well. And some of them, of course, are very common and very understandable, as we know, through best practices. But of course, having welcoming environments, that meaningful and authentic relationship building, A lot of classes are starting to start the day at least with restorative circle. So they're coordinating a bit so that making sure that, you know, there's a series of teachers on board so that most students are getting that restorative start to their day. Giving lots of opportunities for voice and choice in the classroom for engagement and assessment, making sure there's lots of movement and engagement as part of activities, and of course, flexibility in all aspects of teaching. So those are some common themes that we know are working. And just a side note, as I mentioned, we know that our high schools are different than our elementaries. And we've noticed that we do have a couple of elementary schools only, but most of our schools, as Jennifer mentioned, are primary to 12. We have some elementary schools and then some high schools. So we have noticed that the primary to 12 schools seem to be a little bit more comfortable on their journey towards inclusivity, including our elementary schools. And then we start to see a little bit of more challenging instances from grade 7 and up. So we're not going to go over today, but we have acknowledged that and we've planned for that. And so we're implementing a bit of a different strategy for our high school rollout come fall. So one of the most important things too that we feel that has helped us in sort of setting that common understanding and setting the stage is our own modeling through our regional staff during principals meetings and professional learning sessions. We've really made that commitment to model everything that we would want to see in our classrooms to promote inclusivity and equity. Things like starting every session with restorative circles, integrating lots of movement and discussion protocols, some nice collaboration opportunities among staff so that staff understand, of course, and we all know understand how important it is for collaboration, but to know that when students collaborate, they learn best. Making sure we're using lots of culturally responsive learning practices, making sure we have and are providing and promoting lots of culturally authentic resources, that we're taking care of and checking in with our staff, whether it's a professional learning session with classroom teachers or it's our administrator meetings, and even in our regional meetings, we make sure that we're constantly and actively doing check-ins and making sure that we're providing authentic leadership opportunities for each of us to share things that are actually working. And then we would expect, or we do expect, we explicitly expect from these sessions that we hold, we expect our administrators to go back to school and to model these practices with their own staff, and hopefully that trickles down into the classroom. And we all know that once we, make that commitment to take care of our staff, that it does follow through. So these are just, we wanted to make sure that we included this today too, because we do have to practice what we preach. Did you want to say anything to that, Jennifer?
I was nodding along with you, Lynn.
Okay, perfect.
I really agree. To kind of follow up from that, when we go back to our school model, which is the East Antigonish Education Centre and Academy, what I really, really enjoyed about being part of the school and getting to be part of their journey is that there really was that authentic leadership was given. People were able to take risks. They were able to try different things. They were able to communicate and say where they were and how they felt about what was happening. And from that, when we go back to our example of with Marcia and Amy, as I said to you, Marcia started with Amy. And Marcia started with Amy because Amy is now an LST teacher. And so Amy was engaged. Amy wanted to see how this would work. And so she started there. And she didn't panic from, the other teachers' fear of, but I teach science. Like, I don't know what you expect me to change. I can't offer anything to this student. I can't meet their needs. And it was really through those grade level meetings and bringing in the school psychologist to talk to classroom teachers and different pieces that classroom teachers started to see that the change, it was really about building a relationship with the student and providing opportunities for that. And they became more engaged. The other thing that they did that really, really worked well is they started charting their successes. And I think that came from going in, and there was a lot of times I'd be in there to visit the school, and they would inundate me with, they were sure they were doing everything wrong. So when I suggested to them that they start to chart and check off the things that were happening, when we looked at what this young man or what our student needed to learn and what he was achieving, what they started to realize is they were meeting so many of their goals, and they were doing it without having to do a lot of explicit teaching because he was engaged in the classroom. And so that became huge for them, and the buy-in became more, and they were incredibly successful in terms of developing an inclusive model for this student. And they're going to speak to their success in the next video.
As our student was, we had an English class, math class, moving into science class, and we noticed that he was finding joy being surrounded by his peers and being with his peers and interacting with them in ways that he hadn't before. And he was also meeting his goals that we had set out for him in terms of communication and social goals and all of that. So in the end, he ended up attending 5 classes, 50% of the time in the learning center and 50% of the time attending classes. And we introduced him to so many spaces within the school. 3 learning support teacher spaces included in our cafeteria and our kitchen, plus the 5 classrooms that he's in.
When I first met the student, looking back on my career as a high school teacher, I was thinking, I have never had a student like this in my classroom before with these kinds of challenges. The student has limited verbal communication, and I had always taught, streamed courses, and I had never had someone like that and thought about how to include them. So I could really appreciate how people might be feeling, and that if anything, people may be feeling nervous that they weren't equipped to meet the students' needs within that environment. But in the second semester, I took over the grade 9 English class, and having the student in that classroom environment was pretty eye-opening about how beneficial it was, both for him and for his peers. His peers started to gain more confidence themselves just in learning how to interact and communicate with him in different ways. And he gained comfort level with people in the classroom. He still has a lot of goals that we want to work on in the future in terms of building up his communication skills. But there were different moments where we could really see the benefit to why he was there, whether it be learning how to raise his hand and ask for help when he needed it, when to learning how to be patient and wait when he couldn't have somebody come right to him, and at some points, even when students were giving presentations in class, one time he asked, is it my turn? And he jumped up and gave a quick impromptu presentation on an animal of his choice, and his peers just burst into a full applause for him. And it was definitely nice to see how much joy it brought him, and then also to see our students learning how to interact with someone with those needs.
Just before we go on to the next slide, we did previously in the presentation, we talked about each school having their own lead team. And we're about 3/4 of the way through all our schools. As we mentioned, we waited on the high schools. But what was really interesting is we gave all of those lead teams an opportunity to work together through given time from us and come up with a plan as to what their next step in inclusive education was. And every school had a different plan, which was awesome because we needed to make sure that they needed to know where they were and what they needed. And so when we said earlier that we wanted to we needed to wait and see what schools did with this, we were very pleasantly surprised at the ways that schools went about it. And ironically, maybe not ironically, but obviously very important, is many schools started with that, developing that collaborative relationship and working together and trialing things and seeing whether things worked or not. So I just wanted to say that because I felt that it's really important.
Lynn, I think that's a really important point to make, because it's through the working together that you're going to start to develop the conversations to get to your next steps in terms of in order to make sure that what you're doing is effective, and knowing that what you're doing is actually benefiting, and how it's changing, how you can see evidence of change. But in terms of that whole idea of what Amy and Marcia's example is that they just started talking to each other, and through their talking, they started to develop strategies that in terms of changing their own practice, but in terms of changing their own practice, they actually benefited the student, so that the student became a bigger part of the school, instead of in a separate space where this student had spent from primary to grade 8, had spent in an alternate setting with a TA and a teacher, and it was a community living room, to being able to go and navigate and find his way through the school independently. It was huge, but that came because teachers changed their practice. So I think that that's really, really important to note.
And so as we lead into the last section of our presentation, just again to kind of clarify Jennifer's role versus my role. So when I work regionally, I get to spend a fair amount of time with schools and administrators, and to talk a lot about all of the strategies that are very successful towards inclusivity, and some that are not so successful. So I have the privilege of knowing all of these trends. And we're such a small region that I can, in my role, and anyone who works regionally, we all have a really good handle on what's happening in our schools. And so regionally, one of the trends that we've seen a few of our schools start that has been very successful, and this is why we wanted to share with you, is the soft start. And many of you may know what it already is, so we won't go right into too much of the details about it, although Jennifer's case study does really do a good job of that. It's an example of one of those high impact strategies to support student success and eventually to build opportunities for teacher collaboration. So once it's well established, and we'll go over a couple of those things in a minute, but once it's well established, teachers have recognized that they can take the opportunities to talk to each other, build relationships, collaborate on student well-being and success through this shared soft start time, and they can be leaders throughout the school in doing this. So one of the things that all of the schools who are doing this, and I would also say that so far it's in elementary school, but all of the schools who have started this have started with a common approach, and they didn't network on this, but they started with a common approach, which is so important to establish what does soft start mean and what does it not mean, and what can we do and what can we not do. And so as it's getting up and running, and we're building those routines and expectations, some of the things that soft starts actually should include are activities that are welcoming, accessible, inclusive, and equitable, that they're very hands-on, very engaging, they're project-based, inquiry-based. It's a set period of time and a short period of time, that it's engaging, that kids get to choose what to do, but also do things different all the time, so they have lots of exposure to different types of activities, that it's physically engaging and independent, and can also be settling. So it's that, almost as if we mentioned for the high schools, that sort of restorative approach start to the day. It's very similar in this situation, in that it's that little period of time in the morning where everybody needs to just get in and get settled. And some people need to be engaged more and move around more, and some people need to settle. So it all depends on what kids are needing. And actually adults need it too. And so it was also important to understand, what does it not include? And housekeeping is a big thing. So we all know, that you start the day, of course, attendance is always important, but the lunch money and the library books and all of these things. And it's not that those things weren't important, but was suggested by the schools is to move that to another block of time in the day, whether it's right before the first morning break or right after, or some other common time. But to back up and allow that soft start to have such a great start to the day. And things like silent reading, things that you would do normally anyway, should not be included in that soft start. Keep the technology away. We have assessment there, but we have that there under the understanding that when starting soft starts, the most important role of the teacher, of course, is to engage students, engage with them with each other, teach those routines and expectations, to circulate, to check in, see how everyone's doing. And then over time, so once those routines and expectations are in place, students are independent, fairly independent. We all know we have students who will need more support than others, but then teachers can start to do things that are a bit more implicit and dynamic and purposeful. So things like observations, student interviews, some skill building activities, some independence building, making more curriculum connections all the time. And then eventually, as we mentioned earlier, build in that time for collaborating with your learning support people. So Jennifer's going to feature one of the schools, it's actually the same school that we've been speaking about all along, who did go ahead quite early in the year actually and implement a soft start. Just before we do that though, I wanted to flash this up. When thinking about soft starts and when talking about soft starts, this is a wordle that one of the schools came up with to kind of say, in a nutshell, this is what a soft start is.
As Lynn was saying, the school that we were featuring is a P to 12. So we showed kind of what was happening at the high school end, and as suggested by the vice principal, the schools primary to 6 had a pretty solid understanding of what inclusion and how to be inclusive was. And one of the strategies that they used was a soft start. So this is a grade 1-2 teacher, Jessica Bro. It's her classroom, and the learning support teacher, Jan Kavanaugh. So when we talked about coaching and finding that time for collaboration, it was actually Jan that capitalized on Jessica's soft start and found time to be able to move into her classroom. And they're going to talk about that in the next video segment.
So I just want to say, and Jennifer and I have talked about this, so we don't have our own video editing crew here at SRCE. So Jennifer did a ton of work and was this is very real. And this video is actually shot during a soft start, right?
It was actually, I will tell you, I was going to save this piece, but it was shot on the last. Yeah, that's okay. It was shot on the last day of school, and the students are present while the teachers are sitting and talking to me. And this is very important because I'm going to speak to that in a little bit.
The best times for us to collaborate was actually during Jessica's soft start to her day. So a soft start is something that Jessica uses in her room, has many benefits for her students, and as a side benefit for me is that it really provided a good time for us to touch base on the daily at the start of the day about how things were going for our shared students, how I could support her, and things like that. So I'll let Jessica talk about what soft start is and why she does it.
So a lot of the times I have to check in with Jan. So end of the days are really busy. So usually at the beginning of the day, we usually check in with each other, how our students are doing. Monday mornings are pretty hectic here in the mornings that children are coming in from the weekends, and so we check in with our students, we check in with each other to see if any other services are needed during that day or the week. And so the morning soft start gives some time for us to collaborate, and not just with Jan, but with speech or anybody else that works with students that they're coming in for pull in, pull out during the day.
Oftentimes like speech language, they come various days. They send their schedule a month in advance, but classroom teachers are so busy they don't always know what day they're coming, and so it's nice that the soft start they come down. They'll check in with Jess, like when's a good time today to come, rather than just pulling kids willy nilly. And
we kind of schedule those pullouts that lead into their breaks with Jan too, so that it might be busy for them, and then they get to go take their break with Jan. So it's a great time to just schedule last minute things of the day. So the children usually walk in. Check with Fiona. The children are walking in, they're bringing their agenda bags and everything, and at the beginning of the year it's very directed to some bins that are kind of laid out on the tables. It's usually 4 to 6 different choices, and they know at the beginning of the year what's laid out is what's laid out, and that's what you have to experiment with. Sometimes it's a game or a pre-made centaur or some just rocks that I found at a beach that could have balls in it, and they say, what do I do with that? And I say, create. So pretty diamonds, sorting activities, whatever they want to create. So this is our morning. It allows time for collaboration, and I find it's also a very good community builder at the beginning of the year. Children are coming in not in class with each other, so they're learning their language, how to speak nicely to each other, how to be heard, how to make their wants heard and their needs heard while being respectful to each other.
One of the other things that Jessica talked about was when I asked her about Soft Start, because it was very new to me. And when I asked her about where she got it, she said it was during her Master's of Education course, where she had to take a course in Halifax. And she has 2 young children of her own. And so getting to Halifax could be really challenging for Jessica. And didn't matter what time she left, she was always 5 minutes late. And she would come into class and she'd be trying to come in and get all her stuff organized. And one of her professors used a soft start. So for the first 15 minutes, there were different stations set up, different articles that they could go look at, different teaching resources that teachers could go and look at and discuss and collaborate on. And Jessica said when she'd walk into that class, she'd actually be able to sit down, get her things ready, and then she could sit down and look around the room and decide where she was going to go. And she was never late for class. And I think that she said that it struck her so much that she said, I'm doing this for my students. My students, when they come to school, are going to have time to settle in. I will have time to check in with them. And I'm going to make this happen. And as a result, she has an incredibly, and I can't emphasize this enough, welcoming classroom. Lynn, I think we can go to the next slide. The next slide, this picture is her classroom while we were doing the interview. And this is the last day of school, and all of these students are engaged in a writing activity. And one of the conversations I heard in the background while I'm videotaping the teachers, and you saw the little boy in the mask come up and looking for something, he was looking for an eraser, because this is what happened. The writing activity, one of the questions was, tell me about the best thing that happened in the school year. And this little boy wrote, when Jaden got hit in the head with a ball in phys ed class. And one of the little girls that was sitting at the table said, that wasn't the best thing that happened in the school year. And he looked at her and said, well, it was funny. And she said, well, then you have to put it in the funny thing that happened in the school year, not the best thing that happened in the school year. And he got up and was looking for an eraser. so that he could change it and reorganize his work so that it made sense. To me, that's called peer editing. And it's something that everybody struggles with. And yet I heard in this 1-2 class, I listened to this conversation while I was videotaping the two teachers. So when we ask about what Soft Start does, it teaches transition and routines. They're established in September. We're getting to check in with students so that they're able to share personal stories from home and the playground. So one of the other pieces that Jessica and Jan elaborated on is that when you do go into literacy and math instruction and you're teaching, you're not being interrupted with students wanting to tell stories about something that happened on the playground. It's already out. They've already shared it with either their classmates or with a teacher. And if there was any issues that came up from that, they were able to deal with it. Also, you don't have students that are disengaged from their literacy and mathematics lessons because they've been able to deal with those things that are weighing on them. And they've been able to, and they're more focused on what the teacher is talking about. We're developing risk takers. I mean, I love the beach rocks and the orange balls and they say, well, what do I do with this? And saying, I don't know, create with it. And so they learn to take risks. They learn to figure stuff out and make decisions, and the confidence in themselves and their classmates so that they can give feedback to each other and it's meaningful is so evident in that room. And it really is a trusting and collaborative place for both children and adults. So as adults, you can come in seamlessly and being able to support students in that classroom environment. And then it's a built-in collaboration time for teachers and specialists to authentically plan and support. When we talk about meaningful intervention, think about how much, like when we plan something and say, oh, for 6 weeks, we're going to schedule this break for this student for the next 3 weeks, and we'll collect data and we'll see how he does. Think about how meaningful a break is when we can offer the break when the student needs it and if he needs it. And then we start charting how often he had to take a break instead of, no, it's your break time, you have to go now. So they're able to do this through that collaboration time and make better decisions that actually meet students' needs and meet students where they are. So I think for all of those reasons, the Soft Start is an incredible tool to start to build that collaborative relationship for teachers and students.
Thank you for sharing that classroom experience. That was wonderful. That was so enjoyable. So again, we are coming to the end here, and another, of course, strategy is to make sure you review your learning intentions again. And so I won't read them through, but basically I hope we were able to share our stories with you both regionally and in one school's journey, and to sort of put the point across that, you know, by using these really high leverage practices, that it really is in the best interest of everyone, and learning experiences even improve so much more. So thank you very much. We've put our emails there in case anyone would like to reach out. Jennifer is continuing in this role. I'm soon finished going to another role, but if you'd like to email at any time, I'm still here and working with the regional team a bit still to do some inclusive ed. So we thank you. And does anyone have any questions? We do have a few minutes left that we could answer any questions if anyone has any. I really appreciate you being here in this gorgeous day, by the way.
Yes. Oh, Cindy, you're muted.
That's the best way to have me. I just want to say thank you, both of you, because and I'm not saying on behalf of anybody else, just me, because I made a few notes as you were going through, and I wanted to say how much I appreciated the connections, those explicit connections you made to strategies that people could use when they think about going into schools. You gave us some really concrete things to think about. It was wonderful to have the testimonies from Amy and Marcia, you know, that also their story and how they're going about implementing that. And the last thing I wanted to say is that, we've talked about that soft start approach that you've been thinking about from, working on. And there are so many good things about that are, it's evident in the outcomes that you're seeing from, the impact from your learning intentions. And I think that it's really paying off. So, from all of this work, I know there are lessons for all of us to learn, and that it might look different, and depending on your school or depending on your region, it doesn't matter, but there are some really fundamental core things that I think have been really helpful. So for me, when I'm out talking and working with schools, this is going to be a very helpful thing for me in my new role. So thank you very much.
You're welcome. And I think one of the things you said there is it is different for every school, and sometimes it's really slow going, and sometimes you try things that don't work. And it's just as important to know that as it is to know what does work. So
we have to be risk takers, and we just have to try. And that's what I absolutely loved about this school, is that they trusted us enough to try things without having all the answers first. And I think at one point when I was in visiting, they were kept looking for me to validate and say, yeah, you're doing it right. And I looked at him and said, I don't know how this is supposed to work. We're just figuring it out as we go along. And I don't mean that in that you're not planning or being purposeful and intentional, but you don't know what works until you try it. And that was what was beautiful about the school, is they were really willing to try.
And I think that fits in so well with that notion of growth mindset, right? For all of us. That you have to be willing. It's not that you want it perfect. It just means, hey, we're willing to work at it. We want to make progress, and that it's really okay to mistakes. And what do we learn from it? And then how do we move on? Because that is a real shift. I think a major shift for all of us over the last few years is thinking along that way. And I think that's what the soft starts help us do. They give us that freedom, to do that.
Yeah, I just really wanted to say thanks so much for the presentation. I was just thinking of it from the lens of the trauma-informed classroom, and how that's such a lovely example of just the routines and rituals and those regulating activities, and how putting that time in up front makes all the difference for the whole day. So I think it was a lovely example, and it'd be great if more people could see how well that does function, to have those kind of warm-up activities to set the stage. So yeah, I really appreciated that.
I'm so glad you mentioned that, because one of the things that I did forget to mention is those schools who are starting their day with restorative approach circle, a welcoming circle. And some schools are doing a P to 12. And some of the biggest observations from those schools are that they've changed nothing else about what they're doing through the day, but their classroom management has been perfected, as you will, and behavior incidents are way down. And the only thing they've changed is that. And that in itself is absolutely huge. If no one says anything else, that trauma-informed approach, that welcoming approach is it's priceless.